Imagine waking up under a hill that is also a house. Walls nearly 2 meters thick, a roof that grows grass, and a low doorway that forces the wind to stumble before it can reach you. Outside, the sea cuts with a north wind that can steal the warmth off a person in minutes. Yet inside some Arctic settlements, families, animals, tools, and a slow, smoky hearth endured winters that would have broken less integrated communities. How did they do it? There was one reason: a single, unified thermal architecture. Not a checklist of tricks, but a coherent system in which form, material, fuel, animals, and landscape all worked as parts of the same heat engine. This is not a romantic claim. It is an engineering claim. Houses treated like organisms, longhouses shaped like overturned ships, roofs and walls built to capture and store the smallest fractions of warmth, and social arrangements that multiplied every available calorie of heat. Each element served one goal: to trap, hold, and recycle heat. And every element, when combined, created a fortress against Arctic winters that was more than the sum of its parts. If you love deep history engineering, subscribe now. Picture the longhouse from a distance, a dark, elongated silhouette melting into the snow, its ridge sloping gently like the keel of a beached ship. From an aerial vantage, the resemblance is uncanny, a hull made landward. That shiphouse analogy is not mere metaphor. Builders trained as shipwrights and carpenters carried techniques from boatyards to house frames. The same curved timbers that allowed a vessel to deflect waves were repurposed to deflect wind. A broad, rounded profile presents less area to gusts. The wind glances along a curve rather than battering a flat face. In storm-battered Arctic fjords, this meant less continuous exposure and fewer points of direct pressure where cold could force its way into seams. The longhouse's length, sometimes reaching up to 30 to 80 meters in exceptional examples, also mattered. A long, narrow plan concentrates traffic, hearths, and storage along a central spine. Structurally, the parallel rows of posts and the arched rafters create a high central cavity above a low occupied zone. This high roof space became a crucial component of the thermal system, piling smoke and warm air upward, leaving the occupied lower decks warmer and reducing direct heat loss through the walls. The shipbuilding provenance gave the houses a form optimized for deflecting weather and managing internal airflows. The first layer of a broader, integrated defense. But form alone would not have been enough. Timber was precious in many Arctic margins. Driftwood, sparse birch, and occasional timbers had to be used with economy. Scarcity drove a different kind of ingenuity, a material strategy that married a modest wooden skeleton with massive earthwork walls. Around stout posts and a foundation of stone, layers of turf or peat were stacked like bricks, thick, porous, and alive. At the base, walls could reach roughly 1.5 to 2 meters in thickness. Their mass mattered in two ways, as thermal inertia and as insulation. Think of the turf wall as a living thermal battery. Earth stores heat slowly and releases it slowly. Compacted peat or sod traps air in its matrix. Those trapped air pockets interrupt the passage of cold, while the mass of the wall resists quick temperature swings. During brief thaws, the sun's faint warmth or residual indoor heat seeps into the wall. When temperatures plunge again, that stored heat bleeds back into the interior space. Roots bound the turf blocks together, cross-weaving the mass into a durable cladding that could be repaired patch by patch. This was not passive architecture. Turf grew, settled, and was tended like a cultivated living skin on the building. Stone foundations did more than simply anchor posts. Placed below the turf layers, stone provided a durable footing and a buffer against melting water and wind-driven erosion. Stone walls and packed earth create thermal bridges when improperly joined. The Viking builders mitigated this by layering materials to break direct conduction paths. The result was a wall assembly that both accumulated heat and resisted the relentless urge of the Arctic to strip it away. Above those walls, the roof completed the house as an envelope. Rafters and curved ribs echoed ship lines, but it was the roof's makeup that turned structure into shelter. Over the rafter framework came a layer of birch bark, thin, flexible, and remarkably waterproof when applied in sheets. Birch bark served as a living membrane. It shed water, kept interiors dry, and crucially allowed the turf above to serve as a continuous insulating blanket without soaking into the wooden skeleton. Over the birch bark, strips of turf were laid thick, sometimes with grass still rooted, forming a green roof that both protected and insulated. A turf roof is heavy. It presses down on the rafters and on the earthen walls. That weight is an asset in a climate of storms and driven snow. It resists uplift and settles into a form that accepts snow as an ally rather than an enemy. Roots, peat, and birch bark together form a multi-layered skin. Wood frame, protective bark, living turf, each layer performing a role within the single thermal strategy. The roof collected solar heat in summer, sheltered the house from wind-driven moisture, and set the stage for the final insulating element, snow. Snow gets a bad reputation as a destroyer of life, but in thermal terms, it is a superb insulator. The small random air pockets between snow crystals trap air and reduce heat flow, the exact reason igloos work. Viking roof geometry and placement were deliberate responses to wind and snowfall patterns. Long, sloping roofs and careful orientation caused snow to drift and accumulate against certain walls and ridge lines, creating an added, external insulating cocoon. Where wind scours a roof clean, a slope will encourage a gentle bank on the lee side. That bank of snow, compacted but porous, acted like a fur coat pulled over the turf. When snow settled into the contours of the roof and against the earthen walls, heat loss to the outside dropped drastically. This combination, a built layered envelope plus a natural seasonal blanket, is the heart of the unified system. The house and its landscape become one. Builders shaped the slope to invite snow to cling in ways that augmented insulation. What appears at first glance to be a passive, accidental accumulation is instead an anticipated phase of the living structure's annual cycle. In effect, the house wore a winter armor, held in place by roof weight and vegetation, with snow filling the outermost pores. But containing heat is only half the battle. Generating and managing it is the other. Enter the long hearth. In many of these houses, a central fire ran along the long axis, sometimes stretching 10 to 15 meters in the largest examples. Not a single blaze, but a procession of hearths and fireplaces used for cooking, heating, and craft. The hearth's position along the center line allowed radiated heat to meet convected air, while a band of stones adjacent to the fire absorbed and slowly re-released warmth after the flames fell. Stones act like thermal batteries on a smaller scale. Heated by peat or driftwood, they keep a slow, steady emission of radiant heat into the living space. Fuel choice is a story of adaptation. Where wood was scarce, peat served as the reliable, slow-burning fuel. Peat smolders long and smokes, a fact that complicates comfort but plays into the system. Smoke was not merely an unavoidable pollutant. Within the high, unlived roof space, smoke contributed to the preservation and drying of beams. In a climate where moisture accelerates rot, that smoking was a form of treatment. The trade-off was deliberate. To control smoke and preserve warmth, builders designed the roof cavity to hold a smoke layer under the ridge, with small adjustable vents, leora, that let smoke out slowly. The smoke layer itself reduced radiant heat loss through the roof by creating an intermediary warm stratum trapped beneath the rafters. Every element described so far, form, wall mass, birch membrane, turf roof, snowfall, hearth and smoke, is not a separate technique, but a supporting organ in a single living system. The ship-derived curvature reduces wind pressure on turf walls. Turf walls and birch bark protect the wooden skeleton from moisture while storing heat. The turf roof invites a protective snow mantle. The hearth provides slow-release warmth and smoke curing. The high roof both stores smoke and separates the smoky ceiling from the occupied lower benches. Together, these measures mitigate heat loss, retain warmth, and allow the settlement to recycle the heat it generates. Yet the architects of this system did not stop at materials and form. They folded human behavior and animal presence into the same thermal equation. In many houses, stalls and sleeping platforms were arranged so that livestock occupied one end or a section of the same building, sharing the roof and the walls. Animals are living heat sources. A cow or group of sheep produces far more continuous warmth than a handful of people. The warm air rising from the stalls would be channeled by the building's internal layout, low partitions, passageways, and raised benches, to warm the human sleeping areas. Convection did the rest. Warmer air rises to the upper level of the living deck and seeps into nooks where people slept or stored perishable goods. In this way, keeping animals under the same roof was not a mere convenience. It was an economical, integrated heating strategy. Consider the door and window arrangements as deliberate valves in a closed system. Small, low doors reduce the volume of air exchanged during entry and exit. Sidewall placement avoids winds that could rush straight down a long opening. Vestibules functioned as airlocks, catching a gust before it enters the main cavity. Glass windows were rare to non-existent. Instead, small light plugs or oil-filled animal bladders might be used where light was necessary. The fewer the apertures, the fewer opportunities for warm air to be lost. This is simple physics applied as communal practice. Limit drafts, channel heat, and use behavioral patterns, such as a sequence of closing vestibule doors to minimize heat loss during necessary activities. Complementary structures extended the thermal logic beyond the longhouse itself. Semi-dugout workshops, shallow pits lined with earth, provided stable microclimates for crafts like blacksmithing or leatherwork. The earth buffer reduced the temperature swings that would otherwise stress tools and materials and made it safer to manage fires outdoors or under a shallow cover. Seasonal or detached buildings, like saunas or bathing huts, concentrated brief high-heat episodes into spaces that required intense warmth but did not need to be maintained at a constant temperature. In short, functions that would have pulled heat from the community for long periods were allocated to structures or times when their thermal cost was minimized, preserving the hearth energy for daily life. Every practical choice, from the curve of a rafter to the placement of a bovine stall, repeated and reinforced the same objective. These communities did not merely pile solutions side by side. They integrated them so that each part reduced the demand on another. Turf walls meant less fuel was needed to keep the interior comfortable. A well-placed vestibule reduced the blow of a storm on the hearth's effectiveness. Snowbanks reduced heat loss through the roof, allowing fuel to be used for cooking and craft rather than constant reheating. This interdependence is crucial to understanding why some settlements endured while others faltered. A village that had a well-built roof, but no sheltered orientation to capture snow, or a longhouse with a decent hearth but thin earthen walls, would still suffer in the long run. Only when these elements were designed and used together did the thermal architecture become decisive. Imagine a winter night inside such a dwelling. The low door closes on a keening wind. A narrow vestibule catches the cold, and then another door seals the living chamber. Inside, the air is dim and smoky, not pristine by modern standards, but intimate in a way engineered to conserve warmth. People sit on raised benches lined along the walls. Animals breathe softly in their stalls below. The hearth stones glow and shed a soft, stored heat. The roof above holds a layer of smoke and warm air, a buffer that slows the escape of warmth through the rafters. Outside, the wind throws snow against the leeward slope. The building's profile encourages the snow to bank and stay. A settlement from the outside looks like a cluster of low mounds, indistinct, camouflaged, and thermally armored. It is tempting to imagine a single decisive component, a perfect hearth, an impenetrable wall, a clutch of warmed animals, as the key. But that is the wrong image. The real secret is systemic. Houses functioning as coordinated organisms where every choice reduces energy waste and amplifies retention. When one element faltered, others mitigated the loss. When several elements fused well, they produced an effect greater than the sum of their parts. This is the core of the claim that there was one reason, not a single invention, but a single organizing principle: integration. There were clear contrasts where integration failed. Farther inland or in less advantaged sites, some settlements adopted one or two of these techniques, but not the entire suite. A house might have thick walls, but no strategy for snow trapping. Another might position animals nearby, but lack a continuous hearth or a smoke management strategy. In such cases, the intermittent advantages were quickly overwhelmed by the Arctic's demand for constant, balanced thermal control. The long-term survivors were those whose architecture, domestic routine, and landscape choices were synchronous. Now consider how this system responded to scarcity and change. Scarcity of timber encouraged lightweight frames and a heavier reliance on turf, a direct feedback loop between resource limits and architectural adaptation. The local availability of birch bark offered a waterproofing membrane where other cultures might have used planks. Snow, always present, was reimagined from nuisance to ally. This ethos, use what you have, shape it to the climate, and make social life part of the thermal system, is the design intelligence that allowed settlements to persist in marginal cold margins. There is an elegance to the physics involved. Simple principles govern heat movement. Mass stores, trapped air insulates, convective currents distribute warmth, and controlled exchange with the outside reduces loss. The Viking solution applied these in a concatenated way. Thick, porous walls interrupt conduction. Turf and snow work as layered insulation. Hearths and animals supply continuous low-grade heat. High roofs and vents manage smoke and keep the occupied space warm. Every choice absorbed or redirected thermal energy in a way that minimized waste. Yet implications remain. What happened when fuel ran very low? How did communities balance the unpleasantness of smoke against the benefit of cured beams and less heat loss? How did seasonal rhythms, breeding, harvesting, sea ice cycles alter the dynamics of heat demand and supply? These are practical, human questions that point to the next part of the story: how the internal heat economy operated day to day, and how people organized labor, animal care, and craft to support a continuous thermal regime. Before we move to those human mechanics, one more image may help anchor the logic. Imagine cutting a longhouse lengthwise and watching a thermal overlay. Reds of warmth concentrated near the hearth and above the animal stalls. A muted orange bleeding into the stone and turf walls. A cool blue at the outside face, arrested abruptly by a band of snow. The colors do not float independently. They show the flow of energy through structure and habit. That visual is the blueprint for survival, where heat is produced, stored, and conserved in a loop tight enough to keep a community functional through months of relentless cold. There is another tension in this system worth holding on to. The choices that made the longhouses thermally efficient also created constraints on lifestyle, light, and air. Smoke-filled roofs led to dark, somewhat sooty interiors. The scarcity of windows meant dimness. Animals under the same roof required ritualized cleaning and careful husbandry. Those trade-offs were accepted, negotiated, and encoded into social life. In turn, social structures, who slept where, who tended the hearth, when animals were led in or out, became part of the thermal architecture. In other words, the system did not just shape buildings, it shaped behavior. So far we have traced how form, materials, roofs, snow and the architecture of air exchange combined to form a single, cohesive thermal strategy. Ahead lies the most intimate layer, the hearth and its management, the animals as co-heaters, and the subtle choreography of human actions that kept this loop of heat running day by day. Those human and animal mechanics are where the system's resilience is tested, where a failing hearth or a sick cow could ripple into a community risk, and where practical ingenuity found compensations. Imagine stepping across that threshold again, feeling the temperature difference, and asking, how exactly did the hearth and the animals become the operation center for this thermal organism? How did the people schedule fires, tend fuel, and arrange sleeping shifts to conserve warmth? Those answers are not purely architectural. They are social technologies as much as they are physical ones. The next part of the story moves from structure to practice, from the building's anatomy to the household's daily economy of warmth, to show how this integrated system functioned as a living strategy for Arctic survival. If this exploration has surprised you so far, tell us which element struck you most. And if you want to see the next layer, the hearth, the animals, and the household routines that made the whole system resilient, stay with us and subscribe for more deep dives into the engineering of the past. Imagine stepping across that threshold again, feeling the change in temperature like a curtain that parts. Outside, the wind still howls. Inside, the air answers with a muted warmth that seems to come from the walls themselves. That transition, from gale to ember, was not accidental. It was the result of a daily choreography. Fires tended in sequence, animals shifted, turf patched, vents nudged. The longhouse's anatomy only performs when people and animals keep the system moving. So how did the household turn those structural advantages into a living, breathing heat economy day after day? Morning began with the hearth. Unlike a single, roaring blaze, the longhouse's heat came from a managed procession of embers and fires. A hearthkeeper, whether a named role or a tacit responsibility shared among elders, kept watch over the embers at the hearth line. Embers were precious. They were the nucleus from which warmth spread and from which new fires were coaxed back to life after the long night. Stones laid alongside the hearth were heated intentionally and then redistributed. Some stayed to release heat slowly into the floor and benches. Others were wrapped and brought to beds to warm sleeping places before nightfall. Hot stones were a portable thermal reserve, moved to pockets of domestic life that needed them most. Fuel management followed strict routines. Peat, abundant where wood was scarce, burned slowly and produced a long smolder rather than a fierce flame. That smoldering heat was ideal for sustaining a low, steady interior temperature without the constant need to add large amounts of fuel. Where driftwood could be scavenged, it was used sparingly for activities requiring intense heat, such as metalworking or boiling. Households tended peat stacks and bundles carefully, storing supplies under shelter and distributing outflow according to seasonal need. It is likely that communities pooled labor to harvest and cut peat, and that storage was organized to minimize spoilage and weather loss. This kind of resource planning is as much part of the thermal system as the walls that hold the warmth. The hearth did more than warm air. It created zones of use within the house and structured activity around thermal needs. Cooking and smoking happened where the heat was strongest. Crafting and mending were placed in marginally cooler zones to preserve the warmest areas for sleeping and food storage. Wet clothes were hung near the smoke-filled upper cavity, where heat and smoke combined to dry and preserve, but without saturating living benches with dampness. The high roof's tendency to hold a smoke layer was exploited. It dried beams, cured strips of meat or fish hung beneath the rafters, and produced a darkened, sheltered loft where moisture-sensitive grain or cured hides could be stored. Those dark rafters, blackened by smoke, test both habit and design, a deliberate compromise where the cost of soot was traded for extended material life and preserved provisions. Animals were not merely tenants, they were scheduled actors in the thermal economy. Stall placement, herd composition, and timing of indoor sheltering all mattered. Younger livestock, more susceptible to cold, were likely kept closest to human sleeping areas. Mature animals might occupy marginal stalls that nonetheless contributed significant continuous heat. The exchange was mutual. Animals benefited from sheltered quarters and a steady microclimate that reduced their energy expenditure for thermoregulation, while their metabolic heat was harnessed by the building. Manure and bedding had secondary thermal uses. Packed straw and dung provide an insulating substrate under animals and could be used to seal gaps or to replenish turf that had eroded. There is caution in saying any specific practice was universal, but archaeological traces and ethnographic parallels suggest that such mutual arrangements were common where survival depended on every calorie of heat. Human behavior was folded into architecture in countless small ways. Sleeping arrangements were deliberate. Raised benches offered a warmer surface than the floor. Bedding was layered with skins and dried grasses. Families might rotate sleeping positions seasonally, placing the most vulnerable near warmed surfaces. Tasks were scheduled to reduce thermal disruption. Entries and departures were choreographed through vestibules, and people learned to limit the openings of doors or to block drafts with skins and turf when movement was necessary. Children and the elderly benefited from communal proximity to the hearth and animals, which concentrated heat where vulnerability was greatest. These rhythms, work, rest, feeding, were social technologies as much as they were survival practices. They made the building's physics actionable. Repair and maintenance were a continuous part of this life. The turf skin of walls and roofs required tending, patching, replacing sod, and reseeding where grass had thinned. Birch bark membranes, though resilient, needed periodic renewal, especially if compacted snow or persistent wet had worn seams. When spring thaw loosened the outer layers, crews would climb and re-turf the roof, rebind sod blocks, and trim overhanging vegetation that could destabilize the envelope. Roofing work was not cosmetic. It was preventative maintenance that kept the thermal battery charged. In this sense, the longhouse demanded seasonal labor cycles that synchronized with resource availability. Summer grass and peat cutting, autumn repairs and fuel stacking, winter hearth management, and careful snow handling. Vent management, the leora, the narrow roof openings, required skill. These vents were adjustable valves, not simply holes, and learning to use them effectively could mean the difference between a smoky but warm interior and a suffocating or underheated one. Opening a vent too wide on a harsh night would allow precious heat to escape. Keeping it shut too long risked smoke accumulation in lower occupied zones. The long roof cavity acted like a chimney of sorts. Smoke rose, gathered under the ridge, and then escaped slowly. The result was a high, cold roof that nevertheless prevented direct smoke contact with human breathing zones for the most part. This allowed smoke to perform dual functions, preserving timber and food, while the living spaces remained relatively usable. Outside the individual longhouse, settlement-level strategies amplified these household practices. Houses were often clustered in ways that reduced net wind exposure for the group. When buildings sat near one another or leaned into topographical shelter, they created sheltered courtyards that reduced draftiness for entrance and allowed for shared outdoor work in clearer microclimates. In some cases, communal spaces were allocated for particular activities that were too heat-intensive or too dangerous to perform inside the main dwelling. Forges in semi-dug pits, communal drying racks for fish and meat, and bathing huts heated only when in use. These complementary structures were logically placed to avoid draining the main hearth's energy. They concentrated high-temperature tasks in spaces where heat could be produced without compromising the longhouse's steady warmth. Craft and industry were folded into this system too. Metalworking, leatherwork, and weaving were scheduled to fit the thermal economy. Smithing, which requires intense and localized heat, was commonly performed in earth-sheltered pits or outbuildings where the activity would not demand a massive continuous input of household fuel. When intense heating was required inside, it was often limited to times when fuel could be spared or when the communal hearth could be briefly augmented. In effect, the settlement acted as a distributed thermal grid. High-demand nodes were sited where their consumption would not undermine the systemic balance of everyday warmth. The seasonal calendar governed much of this behavior. Summer permitted exterior repairs, peat cutting, and the drying of hides. Autumn marked the consolidation of fuel, the final roofing repairs, and the gathering of animals indoors. Winter tested the system's resilience. Fires had to be kept alive, animal management had to be exacting, and trading or foraging for scarce fuel became a communal priority. Spring was a time of delicate release, shedding snow blankets, patching water-damaged sections, and preparing for the next cycle. The architecture did not stand apart from these rhythms. It was calibrated to them. Where the system was partial rather than whole, the outcome was different. A settlement with a well-built turf wall but an open plan, or with separate animal sheds that left animals exposed, faced steeper fuel demands. Houses that introduced too many apertures for light or comfort faced chronic heat leakage. Similarly, if smoke ventilation was mismanaged, interior spaces could become unhealthier, reducing the workforce's capacity to tend fuel and repair roofs. These localized failures could cascade. Fuel stores depleted faster, animals suffered and produced less heat. People were forced into shorter sleep cycles and lower productivity. Over time, the village's capacity to sustain itself diminished. Archaeological sites that show sporadic hearths, thin walls, or dispersed layouts are often interpreted as less resilient in severe climates, though local context matters, and the reasons for abandonment are always complex. Archaeological signatures tell this story in quiet ways. Layers of soot under roof beams, compacted peat floors, post-hole alignments, stone hearths running along central axes. Each element is a fingerprint of the thermal system in operation. When soil samples preserve botanical remains from turf roofs, or when the stratigraphy shows thick earthen cladding against posts, the reconstruction of these integrated strategies becomes plausible. The physical traces match the functional narrative. Houses designed not as isolated objects, but as long-term projects of heat retention, requiring continuous human and animal participation. This integrated model also shaped social organization beyond immediate household chores. Shared labor in peat harvesting, turf collection, and roof repairs encouraged cooperative networks. A house returfed by a community member reciprocated labor during someone else's crucial season, creating social bonds that were thermally pragmatic. Leaders or experienced builders were valued for knowledge of orientation, for decisions that would maximize snow capture, or for the subtle art of vent control. Knowledge transmission. How to patch birch bark, how to stack turf to minimize settling, which orientation best caught lee-side snowbanks, was as important as the physical materials themselves. This cultural aspect of the thermal system cannot be decoupled from its engineering. Skills and habits were itself a part of the architecture's insulation. Beyond the practical, there was aesthetic and symbolic resonance. The longhouse's low, mound-like profile made settlements visually low-key in a stark landscape. Camouflage was useful for protection and for surviving storms. The same roof that kept a family warm also anchored identity. People repaired and lived in what resembled a living hill, a place that merged the boundary between human shelter and the landscape's seasonal skin. That merging was a psychological advantage. When your house looks like a hill, you think of it as part of the land's economy, not merely an object to be maintained, but a patch of ground to be stewarded. This sense of continuity between building and land reinforced the pragmatic logic of using local materials and adapting to the rhythms of snow and wind. We should be careful not to romanticize. Living in such an environment involved discomforts and compromises. The smoky rafters could be oppressive. Indoor air was never as clear as modern standards, and the dim interiors limited activities dependent on strong light. Illness, weariness, and occasional structural failure were real risks. However, in a balance of needs and resources, the integrated thermal system reduced the frequency and intensity of life-threatening cold in a way that isolated technical solutions could not. The system's elegance is that it accepted trade-offs and folded them into a resilient whole. When viewed against settlements that lacked full integration, the difference becomes striking. Consider a community that adopted one or two techniques, a robust hearth here or a thicker wall there, without the full architecture of venting, animal placement, roof design, and snow capture. That community might eke out warmer spells, but would face higher ongoing fuel costs, more labor devoted to maintenance, and greater vulnerability to seasonal shocks like fuel shortages or an unusually severe winter. The integrated villages, by contrast, spread the burden across multiple supports: structural mass, landscape, animals, human scheduling, and material choice. Each support lightened the load on the others. By the time spring thaw arrived, the integrated house showed its year-long economy. Snowbanks melted slowly off lee walls with minimal moisture penetration because birch layers and turf cladding protected the wooden frame. Stored peat had been slowly consumed, but not exhausted due to the conservation afforded by thick walls and animal heat. Crafts and trade resumed with supplies intact, and the community could repair and reconfigure before the next cycle. Where a system had been fractured, missing the roof's waterproofing, the hearth's stone cache, or the animal adjacency, the costs of rebuilding or resettlement were greater and sometimes prohibitive. At the heart of this narrative is not a single miraculous trick, but an organizing principle that made survival efficient: integration. The Longhouse's success in Arctic margins arose when builders, households, and landscapes aligned into a single thermal organism. Each part, hull-shaped frames, turf walls, birch membranes, living roofs, snow blankets, long hearths, heat-storing stones, animal stalls, vestibules, controlled vents, semi-dugout workshops, maintenance cycles, and communal labor, performed functions that supported a single outcome: reduce waste and increase retention of heat. Seen this way, the one reason in the title is neither simplistic nor reductive. It is a synthesis. The Longhouse and its community did not depend on infinitely many independent advantages, but on a coherent system whose parts reinforced one another. What lessons does that offer beyond archaeology? There is a practical humility in adapting design to available materials, in making social life part of technical systems, and in thinking of buildings as organisms that require maintenance, behavior, and communal investment. The Vikings' Arctic settlements remind us that engineering need not be flashy to be effective. Sometimes the most enduring solution is a composition of modest things, arranged with knowledge and care. Picture the Longhouse again, from the outside in the snow. A rounded backbone of earth and sod, a green or white crest depending on the season, windows few, and doors tucked out of the wind. Now, imagine slicing it open to view the flow of warmth, a ribbon of ember along the axis, animals clustered like living radiators, benches parked in thermal sweet spots, smoke nesting high where it treats the beams. Around that interior, snowbanks cling in a deliberate pattern, shaped by roofline and wind. It is not magic. It is design intelligence applied where resources were thin and the climate uncompromising. That is why some villages endured while others failed. Not because of a single device, but because of a single organizing strategy that made every element count. The unified thermal architecture turned scarcity into a workable economy, turned animals into partners, turned snow into armor, and turned a collection of tricks into a coherent way of life. In the end, these were not merely houses, they were living arks, low, warm hills where people, animals and craft survived the season together. Which part of this integrated machine surprised you most? The roof that grows like a skin, the hearthstones that keep a night warm, or the simple fact that your neighbor's cow was also your heater? Tell us in the comments which element you found most striking, and if you want more deep dives into the clever engineering of the past, subscribe and let us know what topic we should explore next. Remember the image from the beginning. Not just buildings, but breathing hills, houses that turned frost into a shield. That integrated logic is the one reason Viking villages could live on where others could not.